Ready to study a whopper of a scene, Act 3, Scene 4 of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night? Let's get on with it.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
Just a reminder, you need to have read Act 3, Scene 4 in full before watching this video. If you haven't, go away and do this now.
Time for my brief summary of Act 3, Scene 4. Dear viewers, subscribers and pupils, it's a whopper of a scene, the longest in the play. It begins with the eagerly anticipated first meeting between Malvolio and Olivia post-letter. The latter is understandably baffled by the former's appearance, yellow stockings, cross-gartered, and out of context quoting of phrases from the forged letter. Maria interjects occasionally to suggest that she shares her mistress's views about the strangeness of Malvolio's behaviour, but the arrival of Cesario ensures that the conversation comes to a premature ending and that Malvolio does not get the opportunity to explain his cryptic references. Alone on stage, Malvolio somehow interprets Olivia's baffled reaction as proof of her strong feelings for him. Sir Toby, Fabian and Maria then enter and treat Malvolio as if he is a madman. Next up, Sir Andrew produces his strange, blustery written challenge to Cesario, which Sir Toby reads out loud. The latter then goads his mannequin to get ready for a bout with Cesario in the garden's grounds. Following a typically frustrating, on both sides, exchange between Olivia and Viola, "I love you, you heartless fiends. No, you don't. You should love my master." Sir Toby nabs Viola to inform her that she has wronged Sir Andrew and the consequence must be a duel. In this section of the scene, both Viola and Sir Andrew are informed of the other's ferociousness as fighters, and eventually the exceptionally reluctant fighters find themselves opposite each other with shaking swords. Fortunately for them, there is no duel as Antonio rushes in. Mistaking Viola for Sebastian, he insists that he must fight on his friend's behalf. However, just before he takes on and indignant at losing the spectacle of Sir Andrew versus Cesario Sir Toby, officers march in and arrest him. Antonio asks for his purse back from someone he thinks is Sebastian, but is actually Viola. Viola is first confused and then realises that this erroneous assumption of her identity must indicate that her twin did not drown at sea and is somewhere close by in Illyria. The scene ends with Sir Toby encouraging Sir Andrew to chase again after Cesario to give him a sound beating. Time for you to answer some questions, dear viewers. There's plenty to write about with these ones. This video will resume in 5 seconds time, so press pause now to write your extended responses. Question 1. This is a very funny scene. Choose your 3 funniest moments, giving quotations and explaining your reasoning in detail. Here's my first superficially rather lovely choice. Fabian, the aggrieved bear-baiting fan, cannot believe what he has just seen. Following their forged letter plot, Malvolio has taken every ludicrous directive to heart, resulting in first his presumptuous preening display in front of Olivia, and then the opportunity for Fabian and others to goad him as a madman. So on one level, this is an expression of incredulity. But the joke lies in the fact that, of course, these events are taking place on a stage. Such an explicit meta-theatrical suggestion about the artificiality of events is relatively rare and comic within a genre in which there is an unspoken agreement between cast and audience that they are watching some kind of representation of reality. From an intertextual point of view, It is far more light-hearted to have acting on a stage being referred to hypothetically, rather than the stage being used as a grand metaphor for the great tragedy that is humanity, as happens more typically in Shakespeare. Both Macbeth and Lear use the stage to represent the much larger physical spaces inhabited by impotent, grasping human beings. Whilst even in a comedy with similarities to Twelfth Night, Jaques in As You Like It takes the metaphor as an opportunity to imply the depressingly restricted formulaic nature of existence. So from one easy laugh to another. Whatever your opinion of Sir Toby Belch, and the more I reread this play, the more I begin to dislike him, he is certainly a memorable character, whose language is equally memorable and frequently comic. This entirely fictitious description of Sir Andrew is rather fun, isn't it? And whilst Sir Toby certainly achieves his goal of frightening the life out of Viola about Sir Andrew's ferociousness as a fighter, he still manages to belittle the man he so evidently despises. Quite an achievement. He can't resist pointing out that Sir Andrew was not made a knight because of any chivalric military service. The rapier, the sword remained unhatched or unused, but because of some kind of indoor political negotiation, carpet consideration. This alliterative phrase sounds somewhat scornful in tone. The reference to the typically soft furnishings of a room's floor conjures up images of luxury and lazy ease rather than vigorous manliness. However, he moves on quickly from this potentially goal-defeating quip to the hyperbole of Sir Andrew being a devil, someone who is manically evil and burning with rage and desire to harm when fighting privately. What about Sir Toby's phrasing here? We would, of course, more naturally expect the subject he at the beginning of the clause. But Sir Toby's utterances are rarely mundane or predictable. By positioning souls and bodies at the beginning of the clause, Sir Toby is dramatising the consequences of Sir Andrew's ferocity, whilst we have to wait until the end of the clause for the number of his victims, not one, not two, but three. Whilst in this context, divorce suggests a painful, fatal separation of the essence of humanity and its physical confines. The whole speech is comically and ridiculously melodramatic, none more so than this phrase, pangs of death and sepulchre. Pangs are sudden, sharp spasms of pain. And so this noun confirms the amount of suffering that will come as a result of the duel that must, according to Sir Toby, take place. Whilst the explicit reference to death and sepulchre, the stone structure where someone is buried, typically a tomb, states that only one combatant will be able to survive this ferocious encounter. In the audience, we're able to laugh at Viola Cesario's increasingly alarmed facial expressions and language, because we know full well that of all the men in the play, Sir Andrew is the least likely to harm even a flea. After all, in Act 3, Scene 2, Sir Toby himself has confirmed that if Sir Andrew were to be opened up, his liver, remember where the Elizabethans believed passions emanated, is entirely empty. And for my third choice, predictably a little childish, Malvolio is quoting back Mariah's forged letter. How can any actor refuse the temptation to literally enact the movement and direction implied by the verb thrust? Alec Guinness, playing Malvolio in the 1970 TV adaptation, certainly couldn't.
Some achieve greatness,
What sayest thou?
and some have greatness thrust upon them.
Peter Cummins enjoyed himself even more in the 1986 version of the play, directed by Neil Armfields.
Some achieve greatness.
What sayest thou?
And some have greatness thrust.
Madam.
Question 2. Explore the conflict between appearance and reality in this scene. Well, let's face it, there's an extraordinary amount of deception going on here. Where to start?
Well, the woman who appears to be the page Cesario, but is actually the young lady Viola, is as good a place as any. In earlier scenes, we have already begun to see unforeseen consequences of her disguise, i.e. Olivia falling in love with her and her feelings about that. Remember her sombre lines from Act 2, Scene 2, after realising that she has totally unwittingly ensnared Olivia. However, the idea of her being trapped and potentially endangered by her hastily adopted persona is developed further in the scene, with the Sotobi engineered challenge to fight Sir Andrew. She might well bleat to Fabian that she has far more of the characteristics of a prayer and peace-loving priest than its presumed antithesis, a knight, presumably one not of the carpet consideration persuasion. But this cannot prevent her from having to participate in the duel. Her appearance as a man has left her powerless. So Viola, still relatively new to Illyria and relatively settled as Cesario, feels that she cannot reveal her real identity cum gender. Thus, Sotobi and Olivia are emphatically not to blame in feeling that Cesario should at least be open to either a manly duel or a loving relationship. However, most of the other inaccurate interpretations of reality in the scene are caused by the game's plotting deceit of others. Malvolio thinks that Olivia is in love with him because of Mariah's superbly penned missive. Viola thinks Sir Andrew is furious with him and hell-bent on fighting because of Sotobi and Fabian's lies. Sir Andrew thinks Cesario is a ferocious fighter, following Sotobi's exclamations. However, we should probe these references in more detail. As human beings, surely we are not compelled to automatically, blindly accept other people's versions of reality. Surely as human beings, we regularly weigh up appearances and come to our own conclusions, which can differ from those suggested by other people or strange circumstances. For instance, even the line on screen potentially contains a clue for both Sir Andrew and Sotobi that Cesario may not be quite what he seems. A virago or a virago may be a fierce fighter, but it is a fierce fighter of the female variety. This dramatically ironic moment provides amusement for the audience. Yet again, we see someone on stage commenting on the unusual femininity of Cesario's appearance without realising the reality. Within the same speech, Sotobi goes on to claim that he has already had a bout with the young page and that the latter has already demonstrated horrific intent with his rapier. He has also somehow found out that he has been a fencer to the Shah, the ruler of Persia, now known as Iran. Come on, just how likely is this? Firstly, the use of the third-person plural pronoun they suggests that someone other than Cesario has made this startling revelation. Assuming that, as someone masquerading as a friend, Sotobi might have mentioned this crucial detail when proposing the challenge in the first place in Act 3, Scene 2, when on earth is he supposed to have found this out in the tiny intervening periods? Sotobi may be deliberately presenting a false reality here, but his use of hyperbole and the exotic reference to the Sophie would ring alarm bells in virtually anyone other than Sir Andrew Aguecheek, who, following the speech, should be employing the same words he used to Fabian in Act 3, Scene 2. Slight, will you make an ass of me? Instead, we have Sir Andrew's failure to grasp the reality about Cesario, and by extension his relationship with Sotobi, says as much about Sotobi's malign, self-centred ingenuity as his own dismal inability to think and perceive. A kinder interpretation would be that it shows the extent of the trust he has placed in his fellow knight and friend. And what of Malvolio? He has been tricked by Mariah's letter into believing his mistress loves him. Yet should he have been so quick to accept this false reality? And what does the fact that he does accept it so readily say about him. It's also important to remember that before stumbling across the letter in Act 2, Scene 5, Malvolio was already daydreaming about being Count Malvolio, citing a previous example in which a lady of rank married a mere yeoman. So he already had pretensions and hopes, and had already spent presumably numerous hours indulging himself imagining this utterly improbable future. And here in Act 3, Scene 4, his interpretation of Olivia's curt, baffled exclamations and questions points clearly to a self-delusion, a lack of self-knowledge, which must be to blame for his subsequent humiliation as much as anything Mariah, Sotobi and co do. Put otherwise, Mariah's letter may simply have been the catalyst, and if there hadn't been that letter, Malvolio's deluded sense of self-entitlement and grandeur would have eventually found another opportunity to convince himself of the same idea. Of course Olivia must be in love with me. How could she not be? Here we can see on screen Malvolio, alone on stage, beginning to interpret Olivia's response. As Olivia's steward, he has an important role to play within her household. Common decency and awareness of long-standing service will inevitably mean that, as his employer, she will be concerned about extraordinarily out-of-character behaviour and clothing. However, to ignore the has, the what sayest thou, and heaven restore thee, in favour of a functional command, albeit an affectionate one, possibly made more affectionate due to her current emotional turmoil, is nothing short of ludicrous. Even worse, to suggest that she is calling for Sotobi to give him an opportunity to appear stubborn to him is particularly nonsensical within a society which places so much value on class status. Sotobi may be a drunk, but he is Olivia's uncle. Even if Malvolio were to marry Olivia, she would still insist on respectful treatment, irrespective of her family members' irritating late-night propensities. So both Malvolio and Sir Andrew are led by the malignity of others to misjudge appearances and situations. However, with greater thought and self-awareness, perhaps both characters might have been able to avoid the consequences of their misjudgments, public humiliation and crushing blows to self-esteem. In the case of Malvolio, perhaps he needs to be humiliated as someone who threatens play. There is, of course, one other moment in the scene in which a misleading appearance causes a character to mistake reality and get rather upset. This, of course, is Antonio, who bursts in to take Sebastian's part in the bout without realising that it is actually his twin sister disguised as him. Viola can't return his purse to him as he never gave it to her in the first place, but poor Antonio doesn't know this. Antonio really does get cross and comes to the conclusion that there's nothing more important than kindness and morality. He rebukes who he thinks is Sebastian for failing to live up to the promise and beauty of his appearance. There's nothing worse than those who have such a physically attractive appearance, but inside are hollow and shallow. In some ways, this is the most sombre clash between appearance and reality in the scene. Unlike Malvolio and Sir Andrew, Antonio has no reasons whatsoever for disbelieving the reality presented to him. Sebastian and Viola are identical twins. So we sympathise with this loyal follower, but also rejoice as Viola finally catches up with the audience in establishing that actually her brother is alive. Finally, note also the irony of Viola being the target of Antonio's bitter reflections on the dangers of a misleadingly attractive exterior. Way back in Act 1, Scene 2, she herself made the same point when in conversation with a good-looking hunk of a captain.
Do most Shakespearean comedies have the potential to leave a slightly bitter taste in the mouth? Yes, in The Taming of the Shrew, the early exchanges between Caterina and Petruchio are good fun. But does the former really need to be starved, sleep-deprived and her spirit crushed in the middle section of the play? And is this comic? Meanwhile, particularly in light of the Holocaust, how can we possibly sit by and chuckle as the Jewish moneylender Shylock, honourable and decent in his own way, is repeatedly abused and spat on before being crushed by events towards the end of The Merchant of Venice? So what of Twelfth Night? And what of Act 3, Scene 4? At any point, do we feel slightly uncomfortable with the treatment of any character in this scene?
The two most obvious ones, whom we might regard with a sympathetic murmur or two, are Sir Andrew Aguecheek and Malvolio. Yes, Viola is unfortunate and presumably a little scared to find a sword thrust into her paws and expected to get on with it, but she never actually needs to fight, at least in Shakespeare's text, and her mood is quickly lightened as she realises her twin brother is alive. What of Antonio? Yes, he is exceedingly unlucky to be arrested whilst coming to whom he thinks is Sebastian's aid, but we don't have enough invested in this minor character to worry too much. And there is also the sense that at some point everything will be cleared up and he will realise that actually his dear Sebastian wasn't so treacherous. Sir Andrew is clearly used as a puppet by Sir Toby and others. It is clear to the audience, but not to him, that he is being used as a tool and laughed at behind his back. However, at this stage in the play, he doesn't know this, and in spite of his genuine fear at having to fight someone whom he believes is the devil and a virago, he seems relatively content in his own way, falsely secure in the knowledge of his comradeship with the other men. So this brings us on to Malvolio. Writing in Testing Courtesy and Humanity in Twelfth Night, C.L. Barber is keen to stress that we should not feel too much empathy for the steward's plight. And let's be clear, it gets a lot worse in later scenes of the play. According to his interpretation, he is a shameless hypocrite, a power seeker, not interested in Olivia at all, simply her position and status. Well, perhaps such a hypocrite deserves being taken down a peg or two. But it is these lines in Act 3, Scene 4, and those similar to them, which I'm most uncomfortable with. I just think it's bullying, and particularly as a teacher, I don't like bullying. The overall insistence from Sir Toby, Fabian and Maria is that Malvolio is mad, is possessed by the devil, and they say this again and again and again. Legion was a man quoted in St. Mark's Gospel of the Bible. He is described as having an impure, raging, deeply troubled spirit. When chains, he would tear the chains apart and rush out into the night, cutting himself with stones. Jesus met Legion and agreed to transfer his impure spirits to a herd of 2,000 pigs. The latter all sprinted into a lake to be drowned, whilst Legion himself became sane. The sheer quantity of pigs gives an indication about the extent to which Legion, and I think some other troubled souls, were mad, only to be saved by Jesus' intervention. Here, Sir Toby's reference attempts to elevate Malvolio's foolish wearing of yellow stockings and quoting of Maria's forged letter to a biblical level of insanity. And the three, even Maria, don't let up. Malvolio isn't rude or stubborn, he just asks to be left in peace. Yet they continue to push, they continue to state that his spirit has been taken over by the devil, whilst poor Malvolio shows his continued delusion by picking up on any desperate straw, which might somehow suggest that his mistress loves him. Malvolio is just so desperately isolated. He has the respect of Olivia, but that is it. According to Karen Grief, writing in Plays and playing in 12 Nights, he is so isolated because he doesn't understand himself, who he is. I'd be tempted to put a class angle on this. He doesn't understand or want to accept his position as a steward, and so is far too easily deluded into thinking that he can subvert Elizabethan order by social climbing. He deserves to be put in his place.
Defy the devil! Say your prayers! This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, scoring Act